Oh, thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction. Yeah. Thank you for having me this evening, all the way from Malawi. The title of my presentation this evening, rather this night, is "Loving the Enemy and Mob Justice in Malawi," a contextual reading of Luke 6:27 to 29. Just by way of introduction, mob justice has recently become one of the recurring expressions of community violence in Africa. Studies of policing in African urban areas demonstrates rising levels of mob justice. A recent study of policing in Cameroon, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, and South Africa has indicated the increasing incidences of mob justice. And the rate of fatalities in these incidences are quite alarming. For example, between 2006 and between 2000 and 2004, in one city in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, 1,249 people actually died out of mob justice. That translated to about 320 individuals lost to mob justice every year in one city. Malawi recently has also experienced lots of incidences of mob justice. And what is interesting about the situation of Malawi is that Malawi is a demographically Christian nation with about 80% of the population being Christian. However, in spite of this conspicuous presence of religious consciousness, it looks like mob justice seems to be on the rise. For example, in 2019, between January and November, police records recorded 86 fatalities in the southern part of Malawi. And according to a police constable, he says that the geographical distribution of the mob violence in the country seems to show that the practice has become a widespread acceptance as a norm. He laments, and I quote, "It is quite disheartening to note that violence is so normalized in our society to the extent that ordinary people commit horrific acts in response to various crimes without remorse." Now, this paper attempts to explore the contextual meaning of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in the Malawian context. And the exploration is done within the context of the growing incidences of mob justice, especially for those who are accused of theft or witchcraft, especially the elderly women and children. The argument of the paper is that in a country with over 80% of the population being Christian, the increasing cases of mob justice towards those perceived to be on the wrong side of the law begs the question of the relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in this largely Christian nation. Now, I want to contend that understanding the context of Luke's primary audience, when the text of Luke 6:27 to 29 is understood within the context of Luke's primary audience, Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy and his corollary instructions in verses 28-29 provided a framework for early Christianity's response to violence. Such an approach to understanding the love of the enemy has significant relevance to contemporary discussion on Christian response to mob violence in Malawi. A number of studies have been done on mob justice in Africa, and Malawi in particular. The majority of these studies have been done from ethnographical and anthropological perspective. However, in a religiously saturated country like Malawi, theological perspectives on mob justice remain scant. This paper attempts to fill that gap. It intends to ignite a theological discussion on mob justice that will set in motion a popular conversation on Christian involvement in mob justice. And the paper basically has three sections. In the first section, I offer the methodology and the hypothesis of the study. In the second part, I discuss issues of mob justice in Malawi within the context of collective moral agency and the community's representation of the offender as the enemy. In the third section, I offer a brief reading of Luke 6, verses 27 to 29, from the perspective of mob justice. Now, in terms of approach, the paper is interdisciplinary. It combines a study of Malawian reception of Jesus' command to love the enemy in Luke 6, 27 to 29, and a contextual exegesis of the same within the context of mob justice. Now, part of the research is based on a survey of a Christian understanding of Jesus' command to love the enemy against the background of mob justice in Malawi. A sample of 30 Christians across the different Christian traditions were interviewed in southern Malawi. And the criteria for inclusion into the sample was twofold. Christian commitment measured through active participation in Bible studies and regular attendance at church. And secondly, a history of involvement in or support for mob justice in a community context. The paper's theoretical framework is informed by Magdalene Chulek's recent analysis of the role of collective agency in the reproduction of mob justice in a Kenyan context. In our paper, Mob Justice and Everyday Life, the role of Nairobi, the case of Nairobi's Kibera and Kogorocho slums, she analyzed the function of mob justice in the impoverished areas of Nairobi. She concludes that the mob justice serves an integrative function. Not only does it create community cohesion, but also acts as a reference point for the community's sense of order. According to her, underlying mob justice is a community's representation of the victim as the enemy. This suggests that the quest for preservation and the maintenance of social order leads the community to regard the offender as the other, the outsider, who has to be eliminated. A religious dimension to Chulek's thesis is offered by Richard Shellington's metaphysical analysis of mob justice in a Tanzanian context. In his 2007 paper, Shellington observed that mob justice in a community context is performed not only to punish and teach the criminals, but also to depersonalize them through an essentialist social-religious discourse that constructs them as antisocial beings with corrupted souls. Now, the difference between Chulek's and Shellington's analysis here is at the point at which representation as enemy or depersonalization takes place. For Chulek, identification as enemy provides the basis for mob justice, while for Shellington, depersonalization is a result of mob justice. I would say the strength of Shellington's analysis, which is very important for this paper, is its ability to provide a social religious dimension to mob justice. His position is supported by the entrenched nature of religious consciousness in Africa, which makes violence to be intricately interwoven within the communal religious fabric. At the same time, although the Bible has significant influence on African public morality, due to its ambiguous attitude to violence, its role in the intensification or mitigation of violence is always perilous. The above analysis not only provides useful insights into the dynamics of violence in community contexts, but also the relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy and its implications for understanding violence in a Christian community. Now, while Chulek and Shellington's methodologies are primarily ethnographic, this paper locates the community's othering and representation of the victims of mob justice as the enemy within a theological context. It argues that the community's construction of the offender as the enemy and subsequent violence on them, when understood within the majority Christian communities, where the Bible is a significant source of public morality, raises the question of the reception of and the relevance of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in Luke 6, verses 27 to 29. The paper therefore attempts to read Jesus' love command in the context of mob justice in Malawi. Through this reading, it hopes to contribute to the emerging theologies of violence in Africa. An interesting angle to mob violence in Malawi is the religious dimension that the phenomena manifests. There are two ways of understanding religious elements of mob justice in Malawi. First of all, as I said before, 80% of the country's population are Christians who take the Bible seriously as the word of God. And this suggests that the majority of all those involved in mob justice are Christians. Now, this hypothesis is supported by the results of the survey that was part of the study. The respondents in the survey that was done as part of this paper showed that most of the respondents regularly read the Bible, and they were involved in Bible studies, and they were committed to the authority and the value of the Bible as the word of God. However, over 70% of the respondents demonstrated awareness of Jesus' teaching on the love of the enemy in Luke 6:27. Some of them, about 30%, had preached from or read the Bible from or led Bible studies from the text of the sermon on the plain, and specifically on the love command. Over 50% of the respondents had heard the text of Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy in a worship context. Yet in the context where community norms were perceived to have been violated, 70% of the respondents said they did participate in mob justice and were ready to do it again. 30% of the respondents, while not directly involved in mob violence, were in support of it. It is also interesting, again, to note that 90% of the respondents acknowledge that the victims of mob justice are not always complete strangers. They are usually members of the same community. Their acts of theft or perceived witchcraft are deemed to be contrary to community values and therefore amenable to violence. Now, 80% of the respondents in the study had varied reasons for similar reasons for their participation in mob justice. For example, for most of them, a strong connection with the injured party was a motivation for involvement in mob justice, even though they were aware of what Jesus says in Luke 6. Again, this nearness to the injured party would be members of the immediate family or members of the immediate community, especially where the offender can be classified as not having strong ties with the community. Others were concerned with the preservation of community values. The need to stamp out unsocial behavior drove them to participate in mob justice. In that way, they were helping to create a just society. That's what they claimed. About 60% of the respondents used the example of Jesus' turning of the table of money lenders to justify their involvement in mob justice. Thus, while they are aware of Jesus' command to love the enemy, in a specific context, they explain their case by referring to Jesus' use of violence. Some of the respondents felt that mob justice, especially if it teaches a lesson to the offender, serves as a correctional service, especially in situations where the legal system does not function properly. They argued that where the victim dies without learning the lesson, they said the intention is not to kill, but to teach a lesson. And for most of the death, if somebody dies, the death is not the intended consequence of mob justice. So if somebody dies, it's not like they were planning for him to die, but he died as an unintended consequence. Now, two issues can be highlighted from the survey. The first one is the commitment to root out social deviance in the community, which for most of the respondents was the basis of their participation in mob violence. It follows that if the removal of social deviance involves the death of the offender, it demonstrates the community's identification and the representation of the offender as the enemy to be eliminated. This understanding agrees with Julek's analysis that the death of the victim of mob violence is determined by the community's representation of him or her as the enemy. Thus, the visibility of the community's action becomes symbolic of the community's stance, becomes symbolic of what the community stands for. Secondly, from this survey, it can be observed that Jesus' command to love the enemy is either rationalized or ignored altogether in context of mob justice. This rationalization explains why, in some cases, mob justice originates in religious context. For example, in a recent incident, a mob justice phenomena was triggered by a prophet, a church leader, who allegedly claimed that a missing boy was being kept in the rich neighbor's village nearby. This led the community to vandalize the businessman's property. Further, there are a number of instances where children and elderly are accused of witchcraft, but the context of the accusation originates from church context. For example, it is normally the practice that in situations of unexplained deaths, communities try to seek answers from religious leaders or witch doctors. Most of the time, the traditional or the religious leaders or the traditional doctors, their post-mortem of the death always points to something, to individuals as the source of or the cause of the problem. Now, in a recent study, Erwin van der Meyer, in a paper titled Witchcraft Accusation in Malawi, he identifies the religious origins of mob justice among Pentecostal and charismatic pastors and prophets. His argument is that the Pentecostal and charismatic approach to evil provides, especially the personalized nature of evil and the need to stamp out evil in the community, provides a context for mob justice. Again, he also attributes the influence of Nigerian movies with which depicts witchcraft and malevolent spirit as a primary cause of misfortune and death in African communities as being responsible for mob justice in Malawi. Now, the relationship between Pentecostal and charismatic spirituality and mob justice is possible given the movement's emphasis on evil powers. Such spiritual powers are usually understood as embedded in malevolent individuals in the community. When combined with the endemic fear of witchcraft in Africa, such conception of evil provides a religious dimension to mob justice. This demonstrates that not only this demonstrates the dimensions, the different dimensions of mob justice, but also the complex relationship between Christianity and violence. Again, when we think about the promotion and participation of Christian communities in mob justice, it raises the question of the uniqueness of the Christian community from the rest of the population. Now, for me, I believe that this calls for the development of a hermeneutic that would address the current challenges of mob justice in Malawi. As Otmar Fax has argued, there is need for the formulation of a hermeneutic that would help individuals to use violent texts in the Bible without producing new violence. In a Malawian context, such a hermeneutic should also help Christian communities to engage with the texts that promote the spirit of nonviolence. This paper argues that among the texts among the biblical texts, Luke 6 verses 27 to 29, its emphasis on the love of enemy provides a starting point for a discussion of mob justice from a theological perspective in Malawi. Now, I want to attempt to provide a rationale for using Luke 6 as a basis for issues of mob violence in Malawi. It must be acknowledged that using the Bible to deal with the issues of violence presents its own challenges. Among these challenges is the Bible's ambiguous reference to violence. Its apparent promotion and censorship of violence presents hermeneutical complexity in many instances. For example, as Jeremy Pond has argued recently, while the New Testament promotes peace, such advocacy, when understood within the context of the sometimes exclusive language of the New Testament text, such advocacy stands side by side with tolerance and even promotion of violence. However, we must know that while we accept the Bible's ambiguous relationship with violence, we also take into cognizance the historical role of biblical texts in the formation of Christian ethics. And again, my proposal is that the singular use of Jesus' exhortation may also need to be put into perspective. We know that Jesus' exhortation to love the enemy is found in Matthew 5:43 and 48 and Luke 6:27 to 36. However, Luke's version is not only unique, but also plays a critical role in Jesus' sermon's exhortation in the Sermon on the Plain, in the third gospel. In the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus makes the love command the remedy for dealing with systemic reciprocity within the community. Matthew's version, on the other hand, presents the love command as part of a series of antitheses without any critical role in the sermon structure. It can be observed that from verse 27 of Luke 6, Jesus shifts his focus from his disciples to the rest of the audience. This dramatic shift in the audience is conspicuously absent in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew presents a seamless transition from the Beatitudes into the exhortation, suggesting a unitary audience. However, in the shift in verse 27a in Luke's Gospel, from the disciples to all those who are hearing, has implications for understanding the sermon's significance for Luke's primary audience. At a basic level, the shift implies Jesus' interest beyond the disciples, as commissioned in Luke 6:13. This suggests that for Luke's Gospel, the sermon's message was directed not only at his disciples, but also at the immediate Madishes, including any other communities, like the Malawian communities, who would have access to the third Gospel's text. This makes Luke's text the most relevant text for starting a conversation on mob justice in Malawi. Now, one of the reasons the author of Luke's Gospel wrote his Gospel was for Theophilus and his fellow converts to know the certainty of what they had been taught. One aspect of this as failure or certainty was probably to help Theophilus understand the implications of Jesus' ethical and practical directives on interpersonal relationships. This interpersonal emphasis becomes apparent in Jesus' express command to love the enemy in Luke 6, verses 6 to 6. I mean, Luke 6:27 to 36. While the pericope from 27 to 36 reflects the love command in general, verses 29 and to 27 are more distinct from verses 30 to 36. The former reflects more social issues, while the latter is more economic in nature. It is also important to note that the outright violence may not have been the immediate context of the love command in Luke. From the gospel's preoccupation with poverty, it is likely that social differences, especially between the poor and the rich, provided the saying's immediate context. Richard Horsley, years ago, argued that the use of Jesus love the enemy as sayings in relation to non-violence against a foreign enemy is a failure to appreciate the contextual nature of the sayings and their significance in their original context. He then argues that the sayings were contextual in nature and were meant to address issues of indebtedness of members within the Christian communities and the gospel writers. So such indebtedness probably arose out of Greco-Roman exploitative taxation systems that left the peasants groups at the mercy of creditors. In this paper, I want to agree with Horsley's location of the love command in a community context. However, unlike Horsley, who denies the non-violent import of the text, we want to argue that Luke 6:27, when read together with the reference to turning the other cheek, in the next two verses, has implications for understanding the place of mob justice within any other Christian community, including the Malawian community. Now, the nature of the community nature of the love command, which Horsley advocates, is also supported by a number of lexical analysis, which demonstrates a particularized understanding of this text, which would be relevant for a study, which would be relevant for application in the Malawian context. For example, although generally translated as enemy, the word ecthros, love, the word ecthros, enemy, used in Luke 6:27, although generally translated as enemy, the term has nuances that demonstrate hostility among people who know each other, which has relevance to what is happening in the Malawian context, where mob justice takes place within a particular context among people who know each other. And the best way to establish this is to look at some lexical company that the word ecthros keeps within its context.
Louis, so basically, just one more minute, okay?
Yeah, so basically, my argument is that when we talk about ecthros as an individual that somebody knows, but who is not in agreement with, that provides a context for understanding mob justice in Malawi context and its application and how we can address issues in a Malawi context. In that case, I believe Luke 6, verses 27 to 28 provides a good starting point for discussing mob justice in Malawi in a brief way. I think I'll address most of the issues in the questions section.